The church bells had stopped ringing 10 minutes ago, and still the groom had not come. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the top of the stone steps, her white gloves gripping a bouquet of pale roses so tightly that a thorn had slipped through the fabric and pressed into her palm. She did not feel it yet. She felt only the eyes of 300 guests turning, one by one, toward the empty road beyond the churchyard gate. Her father shifted beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as though he could summon the missing groom by will alone. Inside the church, the organist had played the same hopeful hymn twice already, and now the music faltered into silence, as if even the instrument had lost faith. "He will come," her father muttered, though the words sounded more like a prayer than a promise. Eleanor did not answer. She was watching the guests. Lady Priscilla Am, who had never liked her, was whispering behind a fan patterned with peacocks. Two older women near the gate were already gathering their skirts, preparing to leave, before the humiliation became unbearable to witness. A young boy tugged his mother's sleeve and asked, loud enough for half the churchyard to hear, why the bride was crying. Eleanor was not crying, not yet. She refused to give them that. Charles Ashford, Viscount of Lynmore, had proposed to her 6 months earlier in a garden full of lavender, promising her a life of quiet happiness, far from the sharp tongues of society. She had believed him. She had let herself hope, after a childhood spent being overlooked in favor of her younger, prettier cousins, that someone had finally chosen her, plainly and completely. Now the road remained empty, and the sun climbed higher, and the whispers grew louder, and somewhere in the crowd someone laughed, quickly stifled but not quickly enough. A carriage finally appeared at the far end of the lane, moving fast, wheels striking the cobblestones hard enough to rattle the windows. Eleanor's heart lifted despite herself. Her father straightened. The crowd hushed. But it was not Charles who stepped down from the carriage. It was his older brother. Julian Ashbourne, Duke of Ashbourne, unfolded himself from the carriage, with the unhurried calm of a man who had never once in his life needed to rush for anyone. He was tall, dressed in black that seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it, and his face carried none of the warmth that made his younger brother so easy to love. Julian's expression, as he took in the scene before him, the abandoned bride, the murmuring crowd, the empty road, did not change at all. He simply looked, the way a man looks at a debt he has already decided to pay. He walked toward Eleanor without acknowledging a single one of the guests. "Where is Charles?" her father demanded, though the fear in his voice made it sound less like a question and more like a plea. "Occupied," Julian said, the single word delivered without apology, without softness, without any attempt to make it easier to hear. "He is not coming." A gasp rippled through the churchyard. Lady Priscilla's fan stopped moving entirely. Eleanor felt the ground tilt slightly beneath her, though she did not let herself sway. "You knew," her father said, his voice rising. "You knew, and you let her stand here." "I learned an hour ago," Julian said. "I came as soon as I understood what he intended to do." Eleanor finally spoke, her voice steadier than she felt. "Intended. So this was not an accident." Julian's gray eyes moved to her for the first time, really looked at her, and something flickered there that she could not name, gone before she could study it further. "No," he said simply. "It was a choice, a cowardly one." The crowd was no longer whispering. They were listening openly now, hungry for every word, and Eleanor understood with a sinking clarity that whatever happened in the next few minutes would be repeated in drawing rooms across the county for months. Her family's name, already modest, would become a joke. Her father's mounting debts she knew he had hoped this marriage would ease, would come due with nothing to soften the blow. She had lost more than a groom this morning. She had lost the only escape she had been offered. Eleanor thought of the years leading to this morning, years in which she had watched her younger cousins receive proposals within a single season, while she was passed over again and again, described by matchmaking mothers as sensible rather than beautiful, steady rather than exciting. When Charles had chosen her, she had told herself it did not matter that the choosing had felt more like relief than passion. A steady man, she had thought, was worth more than a dashing one. Now she understood that steadiness, too, could be a performance, worn only until it became inconvenient. Her father turned to Julian with something between anger and desperation. "Your family owes mine an explanation, Your Grace. My daughter has been shamed in front of the entire county because your brother could not find the courage to arrive at his own wedding." "You are right," Julian said. The simplicity of his agreement seemed to catch her father off guard. He had expected an argument, perhaps a dismissal, the kind of cold indifference the Ashbourne family was known for. Instead, Julian glanced once more at Eleanor, then back at her father, and something settled in his expression, a decision already made. "There is a way to correct this," Julian said, "if the lady is willing." Eleanor felt every eye in the churchyard turn to her again, but this time the whispers had a different shape entirely. "Correct it," she repeated. "How does one correct a wedding with no groom, Your Grace?" "By providing one," Julian said. For a moment Eleanor thought she had misheard him. The churchyard had gone utterly silent, even the birds seeming to pause in the hedges. Her father's mouth opened and closed without sound. Lady Priscilla's fan had fallen entirely still in her hand. "You are asking me to marry you," Eleanor said slowly, testing the words as though they might dissolve before she finished speaking them. "In your brother's place, today." "I am not asking out of romance," Julian said, and there was no softness in the admission, only plain fact laid bare in front of everyone. "My brother has disgraced this family and yours in the same breath. I intend to see the debt repaid, and I do not believe in half measures." Eleanor's father stepped forward eagerly, already calculating what this reversal might mean for the family's fortunes, but Eleanor lifted a hand to stop him before he could accept on her behalf. "I will answer for myself," she said, and her father, startled, fell silent. She studied Julian Ashbourne properly for the first time. She had heard of him, of course. Everyone had. The Duke who ran his estate with the discipline of a military campaign, who had buried a father and a mother within the same year, and had not once been seen to grieve in public, who was rumored to have refused every marriage proposal brought to him by ambitious families for the past decade. A man made of ice, some called him. Ruthless, others whispered, though always at a safe distance. And now that man stood in front of her, offering his name to repair a humiliation his own brother had caused, asking nothing of her heart, only her hand. It was not the romance she had imagined 6 months ago in a garden full of lavender. It was something colder, and stranger, and far more honest. "If I say yes," Eleanor said quietly, so only he could hear, "it will not be for love." "I did not ask for love," Julian said. "I asked for a wife who understands exactly what she is agreeing to." Something in his directness steadied her more than any tender promise Charles had ever made. There had been no lies in this exchange, no soft words meant to disguise a harder truth. Whatever Julian Ashbourne was, he was not pretending to be anything else. She looked past him, at the church doors still standing open, at the guests who had come to watch her be humiliated, and might now watch her be saved, and she made her decision the way she had learned to make every difficult decision in her life, quickly, before fear could talk her out of it. "Then yes," she said. "I will marry you, Your Grace." A murmur swept through the churchyard, disbelief tangled with fascination, but Julian did not react to any of it. He simply extended his arm toward her, the way a man offers support to someone crossing uncertain ground, and Eleanor, after only a moment's hesitation, placed her hand upon it. Her father hurried ahead to speak with the vicar, his voice thin with relief as he explained the sudden change to a man who had performed weddings for 30 years, and had clearly never once been asked to swap one groom for another on the very same morning. The vicar's eyebrows rose steadily higher with every sentence, but he nodded, because a duke's request was rarely refused, no matter how unusual. As they walked together up the church steps, Eleanor felt the weight of every stare like a physical thing pressing against her shoulders. She kept her chin lifted anyway. She had already survived the worst part of this day, standing alone and abandoned in front of everyone she knew. Whatever came next, whatever this cold, unreadable man beside her truly wanted from this bargain, it could not humiliate her more than the empty road already had. Julian glanced down at her once as they reached the doors, and for the briefest moment, something almost gentle crossed his features, there and gone so quickly she could not be certain she had not imagined it. "You did not flinch," he said quietly, "when I made the offer. Most would have." "I have had a great deal of practice not flinching," Eleanor said, "this morning especially." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close enough to it that she noticed, and filed the observation away for later, uncertain what to make of it. Inside, the church smelled of beeswax candles and crushed lilies, the flowers Eleanor had chosen weeks ago for a wedding she thought she understood. The vicar cleared his throat twice before he could steady his voice enough to begin, and the small number of guests who had followed them inside, the rest too stunned to move from the churchyard, took their seats with the careful silence of people watching something they were not entirely certain was permitted. Eleanor barely heard the words of the ceremony. She was aware of Julian's hand, steady and warm around her cold fingers, of the low, even sound of his voice repeating vows that Charles had never had the chance to speak. She was aware, too, of her own voice answering in kind, surprised at how calm it sounded, as though some part of her had already accepted what her mind was still struggling to understand. When it was finished, when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and the small gathering rose in scattered, uncertain applause, Julian did not kiss her the way a groom traditionally would. He simply looked at her, searching her face for something, and whatever he found seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded once, as if confirming a decision already made. "It is done," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "It is done," Eleanor echoed, though the words felt strange in her mouth, belonging to a life she had not chosen an hour ago and now could not undo. They walked into the church together, and behind them, the doors closed on the churchyard full of whispers, sealing Eleanor Whitmore into a marriage she had never expected, with a man the entire county called Ruthless, and whose reasons for wanting her, she was quite certain, went deeper than he had admitted. The carriage ride to Ashbourne Manor lasted 3 hours, and for most of it, neither Eleanor nor Julian spoke a single word. She sat across from him, still dressed in her wedding gown because there had been no time to change, watching the countryside blur past the window, while she tried to steady the tremor that had settled into her hands sometime after the ceremony ended, and had refused to leave since. Julian sat with his arms folded, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the glass. His expression unreadable in the way she was already beginning to understand was simply how he faced the world. "You have not asked me anything," Eleanor finally said, when the silence became heavier than she could carry alone. "What would you have me ask? Whether I am frightened, whether I regret it, whether I hate you for the manner in which this happened." Julian turned from the window, studying her with the same careful attention he had shown in the churchyard, as though she were a ledger he intended to balance correctly. "Are you frightened?" "Yes." "Do you regret it?" Eleanor considered the question honestly before answering. "I do not know yet." "Do you hate me?" "No," she admitted, surprised at how true the word felt, "though I suspect I have every reason to." Something shifted briefly in his expression, gone before she could name it. "Then we understand each other well enough for now," he said, and turned back to the window, leaving Eleanor to wonder whether that had been an attempt at comfort or simply his usual bluntness dressed in different clothes. Ashbourne Manor rose out of the countryside like something carved rather than built, gray stone walls climbing 3 stories above manicured grounds, the kind of house that seemed designed to remind visitors of exactly how small they were. Rows of dark windows watched their approach without warmth, and Eleanor found herself gripping the edge of her seat as the carriage came to a stop beneath the enormous front entrance. The staff had already assembled on the front steps, a long line of servants standing with the practiced stillness of people accustomed to sudden, unexplained changes in their master's plans. Eleanor recognized none of them, and judging by the surprise flickering across several faces as she stepped down from the carriage in her wedding gown, none of them had expected to see her either. A tall, thin woman stepped forward from the line, her gray hair pulled into a severe knot, her eyes sweeping over Eleanor with an assessment so swift and so complete that Eleanor felt as though she had been measured for a coffin rather than welcomed into a household. "Mrs. Whitby," Julian said, "this is the Duchess. She will require the East Wing prepared immediately." Mrs. Whitby's expression did not change, though something tightened at the corners of her mouth. "Of course, Your Grace. We had understood the wedding was to be Master Charles's." "Plans changed," Julian said, in a tone that closed the subject entirely. Eleanor felt the weight of every servant's curiosity pressing against her as she followed Mrs. Whitby into the manor, though none of them dared voice a single question aloud. The entrance hall stretched upward into shadowed ceilings, portraits of stern Ashbourne ancestors lining the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow her every step with the same quiet disapproval she imagined the living members of this family might soon show as well. Her rooms, when she reached them, were larger than anything she had known in her father's modest house, furnished in deep blues and soft grays, a fire already burning in the hearth despite the mild afternoon. It should have felt like comfort. Instead, surrounded by unfamiliar furniture and a silence so complete she could hear her own heartbeat, it felt like exile. She did not see Julian again until dinner. The dining room was long enough that they sat at opposite ends of the table, a distance Eleanor found almost comical given they had been married only hours earlier. Julian ate with the same measured precision he brought to everything else, speaking only when necessary, offering nothing of himself beyond what politeness required. "Your mother," Eleanor ventured partway through the meal, hoping to find some thread of conversation between them. "Will she be joining us?" "My mother passed 3 years ago," Julian said, without looking up from his plate. "As did my father, the year before. I am sorry, I did not know. There was no reason you should have." The bluntness of the response might have felt cruel from another man, but Eleanor was beginning to sense that Julian simply did not know how to soften his words, or perhaps had long ago decided it was not worth the effort. She studied him across the long table, searching for some sign of the grief he must have carried through those losses, but his face remained as composed as ever. "There is a Dowager Duchess in residence, however," Julian added after a moment, as though remembering a detail he had nearly forgotten to mention. "My grandmother. She lives in the West Wing and rarely leaves it, though she will expect to meet you before the week is out. Should I be concerned?" For the first time since the wedding, something close to amusement flickered across Julian's face. "She is exacting," he said. "She will not make this easy for you, but she respects honesty more than obedience, so I would advise against pretending to be anything you are not." It was, Eleanor realized, the closest thing to genuine advice he had offered her all day, and she found herself grateful for it despite everything. The days that followed settled into a strange, careful rhythm. Julian left each morning before Eleanor woke, occupied with matters of the estate that he never discussed with her, and returned each evening only in time for a dinner conducted with the same measured silence as the first. He gave her every material comfort a wife could want, new gowns arriving from London within the week, an allowance generous enough to make her father's modest household seem like a distant memory, servants instructed to attend to her every request. What he did not give her was himself. Eleanor told herself this was exactly what she had agreed to. A marriage of convenience, built on obligation rather than affection, required nothing more than mutual civility, and civility, at least, Julian offered in abundance. And yet, some quiet part of her had hoped for something warmer, even knowing how foolish that hope was. She began exploring the manor during the long hours of his absence, partly from curiosity and partly to escape the suffocating stillness of her own rooms. It was during one of these explorations, 3 days after her arrival, that she overheard two housemaids speaking in a narrow corridor near the kitchens, unaware she was close enough to hear. "She was meant for the younger brother," one of them was saying, her voice pitched low but not low enough. "Everyone knows it, left at the altar and picked up like a parcel nobody claimed. His Grace never does anything without reason," the other replied. "Mark me, there is more to this than obligation. I have never seen him move so quickly for anything." Eleanor stepped back before either maid could notice her, her cheeks burning, uncertain whether the humiliation of being discussed like gossip or the strange flutter of hope stirred by the second maid's words bothered her more. That evening, at dinner, Julian noticed she had barely touched her food. "You are not eating," he said, the observation delivered without any particular warmth, simply a fact he had catalogued and decided to mention. "I am not hungry. You did not eat at breakfast either. Mrs. Whitby mentioned it to me." Eleanor set down her fork, surprised. "You asked the housekeeper about my meals." "I asked her to inform me if anything seemed amiss," Julian said, meeting her gaze directly for once. "You are my wife. Your welfare is my responsibility now, whatever the circumstances of how that came to be." The statement, delivered so plainly, without any attempt at tenderness, still managed to unsettle something in Eleanor's chest. She had spent 3 days convinced he saw her as an obligation to be managed rather than a person to be considered, and yet here was proof, however small, that he was paying closer attention than she had realized. "I overheard something today," she said before she could stop herself. "The staff, speaking of why you married me so quickly." Julian's expression did not change, but his hand stilled against the table. "And what did they say?" "That there was more to it than obligation." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. Eleanor watched him carefully, certain she had crossed some invisible line, uncertain whether she regretted it. "Servants speculate," Julian said finally, his voice carefully even. "It is what they do when they have little else to occupy their minds." It was not a denial, Eleanor noticed. It was also not an answer. She let the matter drop, though she found herself replaying his words, and the careful way he had chosen them, long after she had retired to her rooms that night. The following morning brought the meeting she had been dreading since her arrival. The Dowager Duchess, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Ashbourne, received Eleanor in the West Wing sitting room with the same unblinking assessment Mrs. Whitby had offered on the front steps, though far more openly critical. "So you are the girl my grandson married in place of his brother," Margaret said, without any greeting at all, gesturing for Eleanor to sit across from her. "Tell me, do you love him?" The bluntness of the question caught Eleanor off guard. "We have been married 4 days, Your Grace." "That is not an answer." "No," Eleanor said carefully. "I do not love him, not yet." Margaret studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her sharp eyes. "Good," she said finally. "Honesty is the only thing worth anything in this family. My grandson has had enough people pretend to feel things they do not. Do not become one of them." It was, Eleanor thought as she left the sitting room an hour later, the strangest kind of welcome she had ever received, and yet somehow it left her feeling steadier than anything Julian himself had said since the wedding. That afternoon, restless and unwilling to spend another hour pacing her own rooms, Eleanor wandered into the Manor's library, a room she had not yet dared to enter, half expecting it to be locked away like everything else in the house that seemed to belong exclusively to Julian's private world. It was not locked. She pushed open the heavy door and found shelves rising to the ceiling, ladders on brass rails, and, to her surprise, a fire already lit despite no one having known she would come here. She spent the better part of an hour running her fingers along the spines of books she recognized and many she did not, pulling down a worn volume of poetry that looked read far more often than the others surrounding it. She was still standing there, absorbed in the first few pages, when the door opened behind her and Julian entered, clearly startled to find the room occupied. "I did not think anyone used this room besides myself," he said. "I did not think I was permitted to," Eleanor answered honestly. "You are the Duchess of Ashbourne," he said, something almost wry in his tone. "There is very little in this house you are not permitted to do." She held up the book of poetry, uncertain whether she should feel embarrassed at being caught with it. "This looks well loved." Something crossed his face, quick and unguarded, gone almost as soon as it appeared. "My mother's," he said. "She used to read to Charles and myself in the evenings, before either of us was old enough to understand half of what the words meant." It was the first time he had spoken of his family with anything resembling warmth, and Eleanor found herself reluctant to disturb the moment by pressing further. Instead, she simply held the book a little more carefully, as though it had become something fragile in her hands. "You may keep it here, if you like the room," Julian said, moving toward one of the tall windows, his back to her. "I am rarely in it before evening." "Thank you," Eleanor said, and meant it more than the simple words suggested. He lingered a moment longer than the conversation required, as though there was something else he intended to say, before apparently deciding against it and excusing himself with a short nod. Eleanor watched the door close behind him, turning the book over in her hands, and allowed herself, for the first time since the wedding, to wonder whether the cold, unreadable Duke of Ashbourne was truly as unfeeling as the county believed him to be, or whether he had simply spent so many years guarding whatever he felt that he no longer knew how to let it show. That evening she brought the book of poetry with her to dinner and set it beside her plate without comment. Julian noticed it immediately, his gaze lingering on the worn cover for a long moment before he said anything at all. "You read it," he said. "Some of it. I thought I might finish it in the library, if that would not trouble you." "It would not trouble me," he said, and something in the careful precision of his voice suggested he was choosing his words with unusual deliberation. "You may read there whenever you wish. I would not mind the company. On the evenings I am there as well." It was such a small offer, wrapped in such careful, guarded language, that Eleanor almost missed its significance entirely. But she understood, sitting there at the impossibly long table, with the fire crackling behind her, and her husband watching her with an expression he could not quite keep neutral, that Julian Ashbourne had just asked her, in the only way he seemed to know how, to stay a little closer to him than the distance he had kept since their wedding day. "I would like that," she said quietly, and watched something in his shoulders ease, just slightly, as though he had been braced for refusal and had not expected to be spared it. Whatever this marriage was becoming, she was beginning to understand that honesty, however uncomfortable, was the only currency that held any real value inside the walls of Ashbourne Manor. 3 weeks into her marriage, Eleanor had begun to find her footing inside the rigid world of Ashbourne Manor, though not without difficulty. The Dowager Duchess, for all her sharp tongue, had taken to summoning Eleanor for tea twice a week, sessions that felt less like social visits and more like careful examinations, Margaret probing her with questions about estate management, about tenant welfare, about the kind of household Eleanor intended to run now that she wore the Ashbourne name. "You cannot simply be pleasant and hope the servants respect you," Margaret told her bluntly during one such visit, setting down her teacup with a sharp click against its saucer. "Mrs. Whitby has run this house for 11 years without a mistress to answer to. She will test you, and if you falter, she will spend the next decade treating you as an ornament rather than a duchess." The warning proved accurate within days. Eleanor had requested a change to the weekly menu, small and reasonable, only to find the request quietly ignored, the same dishes appearing at dinner as though she had never spoken at all. When she raised the matter directly with Mrs. Whitby, the housekeeper offered a thin, polite smile and an explanation about kitchen supplies that Eleanor suspected was invented on the spot. She might have let the matter pass, unwilling to create conflict so early in her marriage, had she not overheard Mrs. Whitby speaking to a younger maid later that same afternoon, her voice carrying just far enough down the corridor. "She will not last the season," the housekeeper had said, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of someone who had seen brides come and go before. Master Charles's leftovers rarely do. Eleanor had stood frozen in the hallway, the words landing harder than she expected, old humiliation and new resolve tangling together in her chest. She did not confront Mrs. Whitby that day. Instead, she waited until dinner, when Julian asked, as he always did now, whether her day had passed well. "Mrs. Whitby believes I will not last the season," Eleanor said, keeping her voice light, testing whether he would notice the weight beneath it. He noticed immediately. His fork stilled against his plate, and the careful stillness that settled over his features told her he understood exactly what kind of comment this had likely been. "She said this to you directly." "She said it to a maid, believing I could not hear." Julian did not raise his voice, did not display the kind of temper Eleanor half expected from a man the county called Ruthless. Instead, the following morning, he summoned Mrs. Whitby to his study before breakfast, and whatever passed between them remained private. But by that evening, the menu Eleanor had requested appeared exactly as she had asked, and Mrs. Whitby's manner toward her, while never warm, carried a new and unmistakable deference that had not been there before. It was a small victory, but Eleanor found herself turning it over for days afterward, surprised at how deeply it had settled something anxious in her chest. Julian had not made a show of correcting the housekeeper in front of her, had not demanded gratitude or acknowledgement for what he had done. He had simply done it, quietly, the way he seemed to do most things that mattered to him, and left Eleanor to notice the change on her own. It was into this fragile, still-forming trust that the letter arrived. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked among invitations and household accounts, and Eleanor knew the handwriting before she had even broken the seal. She recognized the careless slant of it immediately, the way the letters leaned forward as though eager to escape the page, exactly as they had on every note Charles Ashford had ever sent her during their brief courtship. Her hands went still over the small stack of correspondence Mrs. Whitby had left on the breakfast table, and for a long moment she simply stared at her own name written in his familiar hand, uncertain whether to open it at all. She waited until she was alone in the library that evening, the fire burning low, before she finally broke the seal. The letter was longer than she expected, 3 full pages of cramped, urgent writing that spoke of regret, of circumstances beyond his control, of debts owed to men who did not forgive easily, and had threatened consequences Charles claimed he could not risk bringing upon her. He wrote that he had intended, every single day since the wedding that never happened, to explain himself, but shame had kept him silent. He wrote that he still thought of her constantly, that he had made the greatest mistake of his life, that if she would only grant him a single conversation, he could make her understand why he had done what he did. He wrote, near the very end, that he still loved her. Eleanor read the letter twice, then a third time, searching for some feeling that matched the words on the page, some echo of the hurt or hope she might once have felt reading such a confession. What she found instead was a strange, distant sadness, the kind one feels for a stranger's misfortune rather than one's own. The garden full of lavender, the proposal she had once treasured, all of it felt as though it belonged to a different woman entirely, someone Eleanor barely recognized anymore. She folded the letter carefully and slid it beneath the worn book of poetry on the side table, telling herself she would decide what to do with it once she had time to think clearly. She did not mention it to Julian that evening, though he joined her in the library as he had begun doing most nights since their conversation about the poetry book, settling into the chair across from hers with a ledger he rarely seemed to actually read, more often simply watching the fire, or watching her, in the comfortable silence that had slowly grown between them over the past weeks. It was Mrs. Whitby, 3 days later, who mentioned the letter to Julian without realizing its significance, remarking in passing that a messenger bearing the Ashford seal had called at the manor and been told the Duchess was not receiving visitors that day. Julian's expression, Mrs. Whitby would later tell the other staff, had gone very still, the way it did before he made decisions no one dared question. He found Eleanor in the garden that afternoon, seated on a stone bench beneath a row of ash trees just beginning to turn gold at their edges, the folded letter resting in her lap where she had been reading it again, still uncertain what to do with the feelings it stirred, or failed to stir. "You received something from my brother," Julian said, no greeting, no preamble, Simply the observation delivered in the flat, careful tone she had learned meant he was working hard to control something underneath it. Eleanor's hand closed instinctively over the letter. How did you know? Mrs. Whitby mentioned a messenger. I did not need to be told whose seal it carried. His gray eyes moved to the letter in her lap, and something tightened at his jaw. You have read it more than once, it seems. I have, Eleanor admitted, seeing no purpose in denying it. I did not know what else to do with it. You might have told me it arrived. Would that have changed anything? Julian did not answer immediately, his jaw working as though he were choosing between several responses and discarding each one before it reached his tongue. May I see it? He said finally. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before handing it to him, some part of her curious to see how he would react, another part bracing for the cold fury she had heard whispered about in every account of the Duke of Ashbourne's temper. He read it in silence, his expression giving away nothing until he reached the final page. And then something shifted behind his eyes, quick and sharp as a blade catching light. He still loves you, Julian said, his voice low. So he claims. Do you believe him? Eleanor considered the question honestly. The way she had learned this family valued honesty above every softer kindness. I believe he believes it, she said slowly. I do not know if that is the same thing as truth. Julian folded the letter along its original creases with a precision that seemed almost violent in its carefulness, as though controlling his hands required all the discipline he possessed. He left you standing in front of 300 guests, he said. He let you be humiliated in a manner this county will whisper about for years. And now, only weeks later, he writes to remind you that he loves you, as if love excuses cowardice. You are angry, Eleanor observed, watching him carefully. I am furious, Julian corrected, and for the first time since she had known him, something raw slipped through the careful composure he wore like armor. I have been furious with my brother for a great deal longer than these past weeks, Eleanor. Charles has spent his entire life taking what he wanted and abandoning it the moment it became inconvenient, and I have spent my entire life cleaning up whatever mess he left behind, because that is what an older brother does, because our parents were gone, and there was no one else to do it. Is that why you married me? Eleanor asked quietly. To clean up his mess. No, Julian said, so quickly and so sharply that it startled them both into silence. The word hung in the air between them, more revealing than he had perhaps intended, and Eleanor watched him seem to realize it a heartbeat too late, watched the careful mask he wore attempt, and fail, to reassemble itself completely. Then why? She pressed, unwilling to let the moment pass unexamined, sensing that whatever answer he had been holding back for weeks was finally close enough to reach. Julian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the folded letter still in his hand, his knuckles pale against the paper. I saw you once before the wedding, he said finally, the words coming slower now, more carefully chosen. Charles brought you to dine at the manor, perhaps a month before the engagement was announced. You spent most of the evening speaking with my grandmother, who terrifies most guests into silence within minutes, and you made her laugh twice, which I had not heard her do in years. Eleanor stared at him, trying to recall the evening he described, a blur of nervous dinner conversations she had barely registered at the time, too anxious about making a good impression to notice the silent, watchful brother seated at the far end of the table. I did not think of it again for some time, Julian continued. Charles was engaged to you, and it was not my place to think of you at all. But when he failed to arrive at the church, when I stood there and understood what he had done, I did not offer to marry you only out of obligation to repair the family's honor. I offered because I could not stand the thought of watching you humiliated a second time, by someone who did not understand what he had thrown away. The garden had gone very quiet, only the soft rustle of leaves turning gold above them, the distant call of a bird somewhere beyond the hedges. Eleanor found she could not speak for a long moment, turning his confession over in her mind, searching for some trick or performance in it and finding none. You never said any of this, she finally managed. I did not think it was my place to say it, Julian admitted, something almost vulnerable in the admission, foreign to the composed man she had grown used to across the dinner table. You had just lost the man you believed you would marry. It seemed cruel to burden you with feelings you had not asked for, on top of everything else. And now my brother has written to remind you of a love he abandoned the moment it required courage, Julian said, his voice hardening again, though this time Eleanor understood the anger was not truly about Charles at all, or not only about him. I find I am no longer willing to stay silent and allow him to shape what you believe about this marriage, or about me. Eleanor rose from the bench, closing the distance between them, until she stood near enough to see the storm still moving behind his careful gray eyes. "I do not intend to answer his letter," she said. "I want you to understand that clearly. Whatever I once felt for Charles Ashford belongs to a version of myself I no longer recognize." Something eased, just slightly, in the tight line of Julian's shoulders. "I believe you," he said, "though I would understand if you needed time to be certain of it yourself." "I am certain," Eleanor said, and found, saying it aloud beneath the golden ash trees, that it was entirely true. "I have been certain since the moment you climbed down from that carriage and told my father your brother was not coming. I simply did not understand yet what I was becoming certain of." Julian's gaze held hers for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them that neither seemed ready to name aloud, before he finally extended the folded letter back toward her. "What would you like done with this?" "Burn it," Eleanor said. "I have no further use for it." He did not question the request. He walked with her back toward the manor, and when they passed the small fire already burning in the drawing-room hearth, he fed the letter into the flames himself, watching the paper curl and blacken, until Charles Ashford's careless, urgent handwriting was nothing but ash drifting up the chimney. That night at dinner, for the first time since their wedding, Julian moved his chair from the far end of the impossibly long table to sit beside her instead, close enough that conversation no longer required raising their voices across an empty expanse of polished wood. Neither of them mentioned the change aloud. Eleanor simply noticed it, and understood, in the quiet way she was beginning to understand most things about her husband, that it meant more than any words he might have chosen to explain it. Later, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor found herself thinking not of Charles, whose memory already felt distant and unimportant, but of the man who had stood in a churchyard weeks ago and offered his name to a stranger simply because he could not bear to watch her humiliated twice. She thought of the careful way he guarded every feeling he possessed, as though decades of loss had taught him that anything shown too openly could be taken away, and she thought, drifting toward sleep, that she wanted, more than she had expected to want anything again, to be the person who finally taught him it was safe to stop guarding quite so carefully. The following morning, a second messenger arrived at Ashbourne Manor, though this time it was not bearing a letter for Eleanor. Julian received him privately in his study, and when he emerged an hour later, his expression carried a grim, settled resolve that Eleanor recognized immediately, having seen its early shadow in the garden the day before. "Charles intends to call on us in person," Julian told her over breakfast, his voice controlled but tight. "He has requested an audience, claiming there are matters he wishes to explain that cannot be trusted to paper." Eleanor set down her cup carefully. "And will you grant it?" "I have already sent my answer," Julian said. "He may come, but he should understand clearly what he will find when he arrives." "What will he find?" Eleanor asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer, watching the quiet certainty settle over her husband's features like armor finally worn with purpose rather than defense. Eleanor spent the remainder of that day preparing herself, not for Charles, whose presence she found she could think of now with something close to indifference, but for whatever version of Julian might emerge when his brother finally stood before him again. She had glimpsed his temper only in fragments, controlled and deliberate, but she suspected a face-to-face meeting with the man who had abandoned her at the altar might strip away even that careful control. She found him in his study that evening, staring at a letter he had not yet sealed, his expression distant in a way she had not seen before. "You are worried," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, a habit she had only recently allowed herself. "I am considering what I intend to say to him," Julian admitted, setting down his pen. "I have rehearsed a great many versions of it, and none of them satisfy me." "Perhaps you do not need a rehearsed version," Eleanor said gently. "Perhaps the truth, plainly spoken, will serve you better than anything you could prepare." Julian looked up at her, something softening in his tired eyes. "You make it sound simple." "It rarely is," Eleanor said. "But I have found, since the morning I stood alone at that altar, that the plain truth tends to survive longer than anything dressed up to sound better than it is." He held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded slowly, as though her words had settled something he had been turning over for hours. Whatever Charles intended to say when he arrived, Eleanor understood now that her husband would not meet him with rehearsed anger or careful diplomacy. He would meet him with the truth, however difficult, and for the first time since her wedding day, she found herself eager to witness it. "A marriage," Julian said simply, "that he has no power left to disturb." The 3 days between Julian's promise and Charles's arrival passed slowly, each one stretched thin with an anticipation neither Eleanor nor her husband spoke of directly, though it shadowed every conversation they attempted at dinner and every silence that settled between them in the library afterward. Eleanor found herself rehearsing what she might say when the moment finally came, turning over old memories of the garden full of lavender, of the proposal that had once felt like the answer to years of being overlooked, searching honestly within herself for whatever remained of the affection she had once carried for Charles Ashford. She was surprised and a little unsettled by how little she found. Where she expected grief, she found only a distant, faintly embarrassed sympathy, the sort one might feel for a childhood friend who had disappointed everyone who ever believed in him. Julian, for his part, grew quieter as the days passed, though not in the guarded way Eleanor had grown used to during their first weeks of marriage. This was a different kind of quiet, watchful and coiled, the stillness of a man conserving his temper for a fight he knew was coming. She caught him more than once standing at the window of his study, staring down the long drive as though willing his brother to arrive early simply to end the waiting. "You do not have to be present when he comes," Eleanor told him the evening before Charles's visit, sensing the tension radiating from him even across the length of the dinner table. "I am capable of speaking with him myself." "I have no doubt of that," Julian said, "but I have spent a great many years allowing my brother's mistakes to become burdens other people carried alone. I do not intend to continue that pattern, particularly not where you are concerned." There was something almost protective in the way he said it, a warmth beneath the careful words that Eleanor had begun noticing more and more since the afternoon in the garden when he had finally admitted why he truly married her. She did not press him further that night, understanding instinctively that whatever waited between the two brothers went far deeper than the wedding that had thrown their lives together, rooted in years of old resentment that had little to do with her at all, even as her presence had finally brought it to the surface. Charles Ashford arrived at Ashbourne Manor on a grey morning 3 days later, his carriage rolling up the long drive with none of the reckless speed that had marked his brother's arrival at the church weeks earlier, but with a hesitance that suggested he already regretted the visit before it had properly begun. Eleanor watched from the drawing-room window as he stepped down, thinner than she remembered, dark circles beneath his eyes betraying the weeks of whatever trouble had followed him since the wedding that never happened. He glanced up at the manor's imposing front, hesitated on the bottom step, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might turn back entirely. He did not. He squared his shoulders and climbed the remaining steps, and moments later Mrs. Whitby announced him into the drawing room where Eleanor and Julian sat waiting. "Eleanor," Charles said first, his eyes finding her immediately, skating past his brother entirely, as though Julian were merely furniture in the room, rather than the man who now held every claim to her that Charles himself had thrown away. "You look well." "I am well," Eleanor said simply, offering nothing further. Charles's gaze finally shifted to Julian, and something uncertain crossed his features, the look of a younger brother, who had spent his whole life testing the limits of an older one's patience, and had never quite learned where the true edges lay. "Julian, I did not expect you to be present." "Did you expect to speak with my wife alone?" Julian asked, his voice level, though Eleanor could feel the tension coiled beneath it. "In my own house." "I only wish to explain myself," Charles said, color rising in his cheeks. "To Eleanor. I owe her that much at least." "You owe her considerably more than an explanation," Julian said, "though I suspect it is the only currency you have left to offer." Charles flinched at that, but did not retreat. He turned back to Eleanor, his expression pleading in a way that might once have moved her, back when his charm had felt like warmth rather than the careless self-interest she now recognized beneath it. "I was drowning in debts I never told you about," he said. "Men who do not forgive delays, who threatened consequences I could not risk bringing to your family's door, or to mine. I panicked. I know it does not excuse what I did, leaving you standing there in front of everyone, but I swear to you, Eleanor, it was never because I stopped caring for you." "You could have told me," Eleanor said quietly. "Any of it, before that morning. I would have understood fear, Charles. I would have understood debt, and threats, and even cowardice, if you had trusted me enough to speak of it honestly. What I cannot understand is silence, chosen deliberately, that left me standing alone in front of 300 people while you were nowhere to be found." "I know," Charles said, his voice cracking slightly. "I have thought of nothing else since that morning. I made the greatest mistake of my life, and I have come to ask whether there is any way to undo it." The room went very still. Eleanor felt Julian's attention sharpen beside her, though he said nothing, watching his brother with the same careful patience he had shown throughout the entire visit, allowing Charles enough rope to reveal exactly what he had come to say. "Undo it," Eleanor repeated slowly. "You are asking me to leave the marriage I entered because you failed to arrive at your own wedding." "I am asking whether you still feel anything for me," Charles said, the words tumbling out now, unguarded and desperate in a way that might have moved her weeks ago. I know what I did was unforgivable, but I cannot stop thinking that if I had simply been braver, none of this would have happened, and you would be my wife instead of his. She is not a possession to be reclaimed once you have found the courage you lacked when it mattered, Julian said, his voice cutting through the room with a sharpness Eleanor had never heard from him before. Quiet fury beneath every carefully chosen word. You had your chance, Charles. You had months to tell her the truth, and instead you let her stand in a churchyard and be humiliated in front of everyone she knows, because admitting your fear felt harder than running from it. I know what I did, Charles said, his voice rising now, some of his old defensiveness surfacing. You do not need to remind me of it, as though I have not spent every waking hour since replaying it. Then perhaps you should have considered it more carefully before arriving uninvited to disturb a marriage that has nothing left to do with you, Julian said. It has everything to do with me, Charles snapped, finally losing the careful composure he had arrived with. She was meant to be my wife, Julian. You simply stepped into the gap I left, out of obligation, or guilt, or whatever noble reason you have convinced yourself justifies taking what was mine. Something dangerous flickered across Julian's face, the first true crack in his composure since the visit began. He rose from his chair slowly, deliberately, and Eleanor watched with something between alarm and fascination as the cold, controlled Duke of Ashbourne finally allowed his brother to see exactly how much restraint he had been exercising all morning. Nothing about her was ever yours to claim, Charles, Julian said, his voice low and dangerously even. You had a woman willing to build a life with you, and you threw it away, because facing your own failures felt harder than disappearing. I did not step into a gap you left behind. I saw someone standing alone, humiliated by a man too weak to face what he had done, and I refused to let her be humiliated a second time by that same man's excuses. Charles opened his mouth to argue further, but something in his brother's expression seemed to finally silence him, whatever remaining bravado he had carried into the manner draining visibly from his posture. I did not come here to fight with you, Charles said quietly after a long moment. I came to speak with Eleanor. Then speak, Julian said, but understand that whatever answer she gives you, I will not stand by and allow you to press her further afterward. This is the last conversation you will have with my wife, Charles. Make whatever peace you intend to make with that. All eyes turned to Eleanor, who had remained silent through the exchange, watching the two brothers reveal, in the space of a few sharp minutes, years of resentment and rivalry that had clearly simmered long before her own arrival had ever complicated things further. She rose slowly, smoothing her skirts, and faced Charles directly, for the first time since he had entered the room. I do not feel anger toward you any longer, Charles, she said, her voice steady. I felt it deeply, in the days after the wedding that never happened. I felt humiliation and grief, and a kind of shame I am not certain I have fully recovered from even now. But I do not feel love for you, not anymore, and I am not certain I ever felt for you what I believed I did. I think, if I am honest, I loved the idea of finally being chosen, more than I loved the man who was doing the choosing. Charles's face fell, whatever hope had carried him through the manor's front doors visibly extinguishing. I am married to your brother now, Eleanor continued, and whatever this marriage began as, obligation, convenience, a debt repaid in front of a churchyard full of witnesses, it has become something I do not wish to lose. I would ask that you not return here again, Charles. Not because I wish you harm, but because there is nothing left between us for either of us to find. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Eleanor wondered whether Charles intended to argue further, but instead he simply nodded, something defeated settling into his shoulders, and turned toward the door without another word to his brother. Julian did not follow him out. He remained standing near the fireplace, his gaze fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite everything that had just unfolded. You did not need to defend me so fiercely, Eleanor said, once the sound of Charles's departing carriage had faded from the drive. I was not entirely defending you, Julian admitted, something rough beneath the words. I was also defending what this marriage has become to me, and I found I could not stand quietly by while my brother spoke of you as though you were a possession he had simply misplaced. Eleanor crossed the room toward him, close enough now that she could see the tension still coiled in his shoulders, the effort it had clearly taken to hold his temper through the entire confrontation. What has this marriage become to you? She asked quietly, echoing his own words back to him. Julian was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes searching hers with an openness she had not seen from him before, every careful wall he usually kept in place seeming, for once, to have fallen away entirely. Something I did not expect to want, he said finally, and now find I am unwilling to lose." The words settled between them, quiet and unguarded, and Eleanor felt something shift in her own chest that she was not yet ready to name aloud, though she suspected, standing there in the fading afternoon light with her husband's eyes still fixed on hers, that she would not need very much longer before she found the courage to name it after all. Later that evening, after the household had settled into its usual quiet and the fires had burned low in every hearth but the library's, Eleanor found Julian exactly where she expected him, seated in his customary chair with a book he did not appear to be reading. She took the seat across from him, the same seat she had claimed on countless evenings since their conversation about his mother's poetry, and for a long while neither of them spoke, content simply to share the silence rather than fill it. "I owe you an apology," Julian said eventually, setting the unread book aside. "I allowed my temper to govern most of that conversation with Charles. It was not the composure I generally hold myself to." "I did not mind it," Eleanor said honestly. "I think, if I am honest, I needed to see it. I have spent weeks wondering whether anything beneath your composure truly belonged to me, or whether I was simply an obligation you managed as carefully as you manage everything else." "You were never an obligation," Julian said quietly. "I fear I have not made that clear enough, in all the ways that matter." "You are making it clear now," Eleanor said, and found, watching the firelight move across his face, that she believed it completely. They sat together a while longer, the conversation drifting into smaller, gentler things: the estate, the coming harvest, a letter from a cousin of Julian's stationed abroad, and Eleanor found herself, for the first time since the wedding that had upended her entire life, simply content in the quiet company of her husband, no longer bracing herself for distance or waiting for warmth that might never arrive. It had arrived already, she realized, slowly and without announcement, the way most true things seem to. The invitation arrived embossed in gold, addressed to the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne, and Eleanor knew from the moment she read the sender's name that the evening ahead would not be an easy one. Lady Priscilla Am was hosting the first grand ball of the autumn season, an event every notable family in the county would attend, and Eleanor understood immediately that Priscilla had not sent the invitation out of any genuine wish for her company. She had watched Priscilla's fan still in her hand at the churchyard weeks earlier, had heard the whispers that followed her through every gathering since, and she suspected this ball had been arranged, at least in part, to give the county a fresh opportunity to examine the woman who had been abandoned at the altar and married the groom's brother within the same week. "We do not have to attend," Julian said over breakfast, watching her study the invitation with a careful, unreadable expression of her own. "If we do not attend, they will say I am hiding," Eleanor said. "If we do attend, they will watch every word we exchange for some sign the marriage is a failure. There is no version of this evening that does not involve being watched." "Then let them watch," Julian said simply. "I have never much cared what this county chooses to whisper about me, and I do not intend to start now, particularly not where you are concerned." Eleanor found his confidence steadying, though she could not entirely borrow it for herself as the evening of the ball approached. She had grown, over the past weeks, into a quiet, private version of contentment inside the walls of Ashbourne Manor, a contentment built slowly through shared evenings in the library and small, unguarded confessions across the dinner table. She was not certain that fragile new comfort would survive an entire ballroom full of curious eyes. The Dowager Duchess, when consulted, offered characteristically blunt advice. "Wear the deep green silk," Margaret told her, settling into her chair with the air of a general planning a campaign. "It suits you better than anything currently hanging in your wardrobe, and it will remind every woman in that ballroom that you are a duchess now, whatever gossip they choose to entertain about how you came to be one. Walk in with your chin lifted. Do not explain yourself to anyone. Explanations invite further questions, and further questions are precisely what Priscilla Am is hoping to provoke." Eleanor took the advice to heart, and when she descended the manor staircase on the evening of the ball, dressed in deep green silk with her hair arranged simply but elegantly, she found Julian waiting at the bottom, his expression, for once, entirely unguarded as he watched her approach. "You look remarkable," he said, offering his arm. "I feel considerably less remarkable than I look," Eleanor admitted, though something in his open admiration steadied the nervous flutter in her chest more than she expected. The ballroom, when they arrived, was already crowded, chandeliers blazing overhead, the orchestra playing something bright and formal while couples moved through the opening dances. Conversation dimmed noticeably as they entered, heads turning in a ripple that spread outward from the door, and Eleanor felt every ounce of Margaret's advice tested within the first few minutes. Lady Priscilla approached almost immediately, resplendent in blue silk, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Your Grace," she said, addressing Julian first with an exaggerated curtsy before turning to Eleanor with considerably less warmth. "And the new Duchess. How fortunate that everything worked out so neatly for you, in the end." "Fortune had very little to do with it," Julian said before Eleanor could respond, his tone pleasant but carrying an edge sharp enough that Priscilla's smile faltered slightly. "My wife's character speaks for itself, Lady Priscilla. I imagine that is precisely why my brother's absence troubled him so little in the end. He knew, I think, that she deserved better than what he was prepared to offer." It was not the response Priscilla had clearly been expecting, and she recovered with visible effort, offering a thin laugh before excusing herself toward another cluster of guests. Eleanor watched her go, something like admiration mixing with relief in her chest. "You did not need to defend me," she murmured, echoing words she had said to him once before, in the drawing room after Charles's visit. "I find I rather enjoy doing it," Julian said, guiding her toward the dance floor as the orchestra began a new set. "Perhaps you should grow accustomed to it." They danced together for the first time that evening, and Eleanor found herself surprised by how naturally her husband moved, how steady his hand felt at her waist, how the careful distance he had once kept between them at every meal and every conversation seemed, on the dance floor at least, to have entirely dissolved. For a few minutes, surrounded by candlelight and music and the watchful eyes of the entire county, Eleanor allowed herself simply to enjoy being exactly where she was. "You are smiling," Julian observed quietly as they turned through the steps, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it over the music. "I had not noticed," Eleanor admitted, though she felt the truth of it now that he had pointed it out, a lightness in her chest she had not expected to feel walking into that ballroom only an hour earlier. "I find I like it very much," he said. "You should do it more often." "Perhaps I would, if the world gave me more reason to." "Then I shall have to see what I can do about providing one," Julian said, something almost playful beneath the words, a side of him Eleanor had glimpsed only rarely, usually in the quiet hours of the library when he believed no one else was watching him closely enough to notice. They moved through 2 more dances before Julian finally excused himself to speak briefly with a neighboring landowner about matters of trade, leaving Eleanor for a short while among a cluster of women she recognized from earlier gatherings, none of whom had ever shown her particular warmth before that evening. Now curiosity plain on their faces, they drew her into conversation with a friendliness that felt entirely new, asking after the manor, after her impressions of married life, after whether the rumors of the Duke's coldness held any truth at all. "He is not cold," Eleanor found herself saying, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "He simply does not waste his warmth on people who have not earned it." The women exchanged glances, clearly unaccustomed to hearing the Duke of Ashbourne defended so plainly, and Eleanor felt a small, private satisfaction in watching the shape of the county's opinion begin, however slowly, to shift. The evening might have passed without further incident had Charles not arrived, uninvited and clearly unwelcome, a little past 10 o'clock. Eleanor saw him first, standing near the entrance with the unsteady posture of a man who had spent the earlier part of the evening drinking rather than gathering his courage properly. He scanned the crowded ballroom until his eyes found her, and something in his expression, desperate and reckless in equal measure, sent a cold thread of unease through her chest. "Julian," she said quietly, touching her husband's arm. Julian followed her gaze and went very still. Charles crossed the ballroom floor with unsteady determination, ignoring the startled looks of the guests he pushed past, until he stood only a few feet from where Eleanor and Julian remained near the edge of the dance floor. The orchestra faltered slightly, several dancers slowing to watch, and Eleanor felt the familiar, humiliating sensation of every eye in the room turning toward her once again. "I told myself I would not come," Charles said, his voice too loud for the space, carrying further than he seemed to realize. "I told myself I would let it be finished, the way you asked, but I saw the invitation, and I could not stay away, watching you dance with him as though nothing happened, as though I never mattered to you at all." "Charles," Eleanor said quietly, mortification creeping up her neck as more guests turned to watch, "this is not the place." "When is the place then?" Charles demanded, something wild and unraveling in his voice. "You would not see me at the manor. You will not answer my letters. Am I meant to simply disappear and watch you build a life with my own brother, and say nothing at all about what we once had?" "What you once had," Julian said, stepping forward, his voice low but carrying easily across the sudden hush that had fallen over the surrounding guests, "was a woman who trusted you completely, and you repaid that trust by abandoning her in front of everyone she knew. You do not have the right to demand anything from her now, least of all in a public ballroom, in front of witnesses who will spend the next month repeating every word of this to anyone who will listen. I am not asking for anything from you, Charles snapped, rounding on his brother with a bitterness that had clearly been building for weeks. I am asking her. She has already answered you, Julian said, his composure never wavering despite the crowd pressing closer, despite Priscilla Am watching from a few feet away, with undisguised satisfaction at the spectacle unfolding before her. You simply refused to accept the answer because it was not the one you wanted. Charles turned back to Eleanor, some of the wildness draining from his expression, replaced by something closer to genuine desperation. Is that true? He asked quietly, the ballroom noise fading around them as though the two of them stood alone. Have you truly answered, in your heart, or only in the words you felt obligated to say? Eleanor felt the weight of the entire room pressing against her, felt Julian's steady presence beside her, felt the ghost of the woman she had been standing alone in that churchyard weeks ago, humiliated and uncertain of her own worth. She thought of the small kindnesses that had built slowly since then, the poetry book, the corrected menu, the fierce defense in the drawing room, the quiet admission in the garden beneath the ash trees. None of it had been loud or dramatic, the way Charles's declarations always seemed to be. All of it had been steady and true and entirely without performance. I have answered honestly, Charles, she said, her voice clear enough to carry through the hushed ballroom. I do not love you. I am not certain I ever loved you in the way I believed I did. I loved the idea you offered me, of finally being chosen, but you were never the only man capable of offering that, and I have found, since our wedding never happened, someone who offers it far more honestly than you ever did. The silence that followed stretched long and complete, broken only by the soft, nervous shuffle of guests uncertain whether to look away or continue watching. Charles's face crumpled, whatever hope had carried him across the ballroom floor finally extinguishing completely, and without another word, he turned and left, pushing back through the crowd toward the entrance, disappearing into the night beyond the tall doors. The orchestra, after a hesitant pause, resumed playing, and the crowd slowly returned to its earlier rhythm, though Eleanor could feel the whispers already beginning to spread through the room like smoke. She turned to Julian, uncertain what she would find in his expression after such a public, humiliating scene. What she found instead was quiet, steady pride. You did not need to say any of that for my sake, he said softly, drawing her hand into his. I said it because it was true, Eleanor answered, every word of it. Julian raised her hand to his lips, a small, deliberate gesture that would surely fuel gossip of its own by morning, though for the first time since her wedding day, Eleanor found she did not care in the slightest what the county chose to whisper about her. Dance with me again, he said quietly. Let them watch this instead. Eleanor smiled, the first easy, unguarded smile she had allowed herself in that ballroom all evening, and let him lead her back onto the floor, where they danced beneath the blazing chandeliers until the whispers faded into something far less interesting than the sight of the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne, entirely unbothered, entirely together, in front of everyone who had once believed their marriage would never last. They stayed until the last of the guests began to drift toward their carriages, though neither of them spoke much of what had happened, content to let the evening close on its own terms, rather than dissect it in front of curious ears that might still be listening. It was only once they were settled into their own carriage, the manor's lantern swaying gently outside the window as the horses pulled away from Priscilla Am's grand house, that Eleanor finally allowed the tension of the evening to leave her shoulders. I did not expect him to come, she admitted quietly, watching the dark countryside slide past. I thought, after the drawing room, after everything I said to him there, that he understood it was finished. Some men require a public failure before a private one becomes real to them, Julian said, his voice gentle in the darkness of the carriage. I do not believe he will trouble you again, not after tonight. Whatever remained of his hope, I think you extinguished it thoroughly, in front of an audience large enough that he cannot pretend it did not happen. Do you think less of me? Eleanor asked, some old anxiety surfacing despite everything, for the scene it caused, for the gossip that will surely follow us both by morning. Julian reached across the carriage and took her hand, his thumb tracing slowly across her knuckles in a gesture so unlike his usual careful restraint that Eleanor felt her breath catch slightly. I think, he said, that I have never been prouder to call anyone my wife than I was standing beside you tonight, watching you speak a truth that could have been softened or hidden, and choosing instead to say it plainly, in front of everyone who ever doubted you. Gossip fades, Eleanor. What you did tonight will not. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, Julian's hand still wrapped around hers, and when they finally arrived back at Ashbourne Manor, the household long since retired for the night, neither of them seemed eager to part ways at the top of the staircase the way they had every other evening since the wedding. "Will you sit with me a while?" Julian asked, something almost uncertain in the question, so unlike the composed man who had faced down his brother in front of an entire ballroom only hours earlier. "In the library. I find I am not yet ready for the evening to end." "I would like that," Eleanor said, echoing words she had once given him weeks earlier, and found, following him down the darkened corridor toward the familiar warmth of the library fire, that she meant them even more deeply now than she had then. They settled into their usual chairs, though this time Julian did not reach for the ledger he rarely read, and Eleanor did not reach for her book of poetry. Instead, they simply sat together in the firelight, close enough now that their chairs nearly touched, and talked quietly of small things, of the harvest approaching on the estate, of Margaret's sharp advice about the green silk gown, of the particular satisfaction Eleanor had felt watching Priscilla Ann's smile falter in the ballroom. "She has disliked me since we were girls," Eleanor admitted, smiling faintly at the memory. "I was never certain why. I think perhaps she simply enjoyed having someone to look down upon, and I made an easy target, quiet and unremarkable as I was." "You are neither of those things," Julian said, his voice quiet but certain. "I do not know what convinced you otherwise for so many years, but I intend to spend a great deal of time correcting the impression, if you will allow it." Eleanor looked up at him, firelight catching the gray of his eyes, and felt something settle deep in her chest, warm and certain in a way she had not expected to feel again after the humiliation of that empty churchyard weeks ago. "I believe," she said softly, "that you already have." The fire burned low around them, and neither moved to feed it further, content instead to simply remain there together, in the quiet, unremarkable comfort of a marriage that had begun as obligation, and was slowly, steadily, becoming something else entirely, something neither of them had expected to find, but neither seemed willing any longer to let go. Winter arrived early at Ashbourne Manor that year, frost creeping across the garden windows weeks before the calendar suggested it should, and Eleanor found herself standing at the library window one morning, watching snow settle over the grounds where she had once sat beneath golden ash trees, and heard her husband confess, however guardedly, that he had noticed her long before their wedding day. Much had changed in the months since that autumn ball. Charles had not returned to Ashbourne Manor, nor had he sent another letter. Word had reached them through distant acquaintances that he had left the county entirely, taking a position with a merchant company overseas, whether to escape his debts or to escape the memory of everything he had lost. Eleanor could not say for certain, and found she no longer needed to know. Whatever chapter of her life Charles Ashford had occupied, it had closed quietly, without further disturbance, the way most things eventually did once given enough time and enough distance. The county's whispers, too, had softened considerably. What had begun as scandal, a bride abandoned at the altar and married within the week to the groom's own brother, had slowly transformed, through months of quiet, consistent devotion that even the sharpest gossips could not entirely ignore, into something closer to admiration. Lady Priscilla Ann had not troubled Eleanor again since the ball, and though their paths still crossed occasionally at gatherings throughout the season, the sharp edge had gone out of Priscilla's smile, replaced by something more like grudging respect. Much of that change had come slowly, through small, unremarkable days that Eleanor had not fully appreciated, until she looked back on them from the distance of winter. She had taken over management of the household accounts from Mrs. Whitby, not out of any wish to diminish the housekeeper's authority, but because Julian had suggested, gently, that a duchess who understood every ledger and every tenant's circumstance would earn a respect no title alone could provide. Mrs. Whitby, to her credit, had proven an excellent teacher once she understood Eleanor's intentions were genuine, and the two women had settled into a working partnership that, while never quite warm, had become something Eleanor valued nonetheless. She had also taken to visiting the tenant families scattered across the Ashbourne lands, a practice Julian's mother had apparently begun decades earlier, and which had lapsed entirely following her death. Eleanor found she enjoyed these visits more than any formal social obligation the county could offer, sitting in small farmhouse kitchens listening to concerns about failing roofs or struggling harvests, and bringing those concerns back to Julian, who addressed each one with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else. The tenants, who had once regarded the distant, unsmiling Duke with a kind of wary respect, began speaking of him differently by autumn's end, crediting his wife, in whispered conversations Eleanor was not meant to overhear, with softening a household that had grown cold since the loss of the old Duke and Duchess. Even Margaret had softened, in her own sharp, particular way. The weekly teas that had once felt like careful examinations had become something closer to genuine companionship. Margaret sharing old stories of Julian's childhood, of a boy who had been serious and watchful even before tragedy taught him to guard himself so completely, of a father who had expected too much and offered too little warmth in return, shaping his eldest son into exactly the kind of controlled, composed man the county now called Ruthless, never understanding how much simply went unspoken beneath that composure. He watched his father die slowly, over the better part of a year, Margaret had told her once, her sharp eyes softening with an old grief she rarely allowed herself to show. He was 19, and he took over the estate's management before his father had even finished dying, because someone needed to, and Charles was too young, and too unwilling, even then, to shoulder anything difficult. Julian has spent his entire adult life being the steady one, the responsible one, the one who cleans up every mess left behind by people who never learned to face their own troubles. I do not think anyone, in all these years, ever simply asked what he needed for himself. Eleanor had carried that conversation with her for days afterward, understanding her husband a little more completely each time she turned it over in her mind, recognizing in his careful reserve not coldness, as the county so often assumed, but the armor of a boy who had been forced to grow up too quickly, with no one left to lean on but his own quiet discipline. Eleanor heard Julian's footsteps in the corridor before he entered the library, and she turned from the window to find him watching her with an expression that still, even after months of marriage, made her breath catch slightly. "You are thinking of something," he said, crossing the room to stand beside her at the window. "I am thinking of how much has changed since the last time frost covered these gardens," Eleanor admitted. "I stood in a churchyard in the spring, certain my life was ending in the worst possible way, and now I cannot imagine having lived any version of it that did not lead me here." Julian's hand found hers, warm despite the chill radiating faintly through the window glass. "I think of that morning often as well," he said, "though I confess my memory of it has changed a great deal from what I felt standing in that carriage, uncertain what I intended to do beyond correcting an injustice my brother had caused." "And what do you feel now, remembering it?" Eleanor asked, though she already suspected the answer, watching the way his gray eyes softened whenever the subject arose. "Gratitude," Julian said simply. "That Charles was too much a coward to arrive, and too foolish to understand what he was giving up. I have never once, in all the months since, regretted stepping out of that carriage." Eleanor smiled, leaning into the warmth of his shoulder as they stood together watching the snow. It had become, over the months, a familiar and treasured stillness between them, the kind of comfortable silence that no longer needed filling with careful conversation, though Julian, she had come to understand, still preferred honesty over comfortable silence whenever there was something true worth saying. The Dowager Duchess had taken, in recent weeks, to summoning them both for evening visits rather than Eleanor alone, and it was during one such visit, a fortnight before Christmas, that Margaret set down her teacup with the same sharp click Eleanor remembered from their very first meeting, and fixed her grandson with a look that immediately put Eleanor on alert. "You have been married nearly a year," Margaret said, "and I have yet to see you behave toward your wife with anything resembling the affection I know perfectly well you feel for her. Have you told her, Julian, in plain words, what you feel, or do you intend to let her guess at it forever through small gestures and careful silences?" Julian's expression shifted, something almost embarrassed crossing his composed features, an emotion Eleanor had rarely witnessed from him. "Grandmother, this is not the place." "There is never a place, with you," Margaret said, unbothered by his discomfort. "You inherited your father's tendency to guard his feelings until they curdled from disuse. I will not watch you make the same mistake with a woman who has earned every plain word you have been too proud to offer her." Eleanor felt heat rise in her own cheeks at the directness of the exchange, though she found she was grateful, in the end, for Margaret's blunt intervention, understanding intuitively that whatever discomfort it caused now would matter far less than the honesty it might finally coax free. They did not discuss the matter further that evening, the conversation moving on to other things, but Eleanor noticed Julian's quiet distraction throughout the remainder of the visit, his gaze drifting toward her more than once with an expression she could not entirely read. That night, rather than retreating to the library as had become their custom, Julian led her instead to the long gallery on the manor's second floor, a corridor lined with portraits of Ashbourne ancestors stretching back generations, lit now only by the soft glow of candles he had apparently arranged to be placed there earlier, without her knowledge. "What is this?" Eleanor asked, looking around at the unexpected warmth of candlelight flickering against old painted faces that had once seemed so stern and disapproving to her on the very first day she arrived at this house. "My grandmother is not wrong," Julian said, turning to face her fully, something vulnerable in his expression that she had only glimpsed in fragments before, in the garden beneath the ash trees, in the drawing room after Charles's visit, in the carriage returning from the ball. "I have shown you, I hope, through everything I have done these past months, exactly what you mean to me, but I have not said it plainly, and I think perhaps you deserve to hear it said, rather than simply shown." Eleanor's heart quickened, watching him search for words. The way she had come to understand was simply his nature, careful and deliberate even now, even here, even with everything between them already so clearly understood. "I did not marry you for love," Julian said. "I have told you that honestly from the very beginning, and I do not intend to pretend otherwise now, because I believe you value honesty above any romantic embellishment I might offer instead. I married you out of anger at my brother, and a refusal to watch you humiliated twice in a single morning. But somewhere in the months since, watching you make a home of these cold rooms, watching you win over a household that doubted you and a grandmother who trusts almost no one, watching you stand in front of an entire ballroom and speak truth when it would have been easier to stay silent, I found that obligation had become something else entirely." "What did it become?" Eleanor asked softly, though her voice trembled slightly with the answer she already knew was coming. "Love," Julian said simply. "Plain, complete, and entirely without condition. I cherish you, Eleanor. Not as a duty, not as an obligation repaid in front of a churchyard full of witnesses, but because you are the finest person I have ever known, and I consider it the greatest fortune of my life that my brother was too great a coward to keep you." Eleanor felt tears gather, warm and unexpected, and found she did not try to hide them, understanding that whatever careful composure either of them had once worn like armor no longer served any purpose between them now. "I love you as well," she said, the words coming easily, truly, in a way she had never managed to feel for Charles, even at the height of what she once believed was affection. "I think I have loved you since the evening you offered me your mother's book of poetry, and told me I might read it whenever I liked. I simply did not understand yet what I was feeling." Julian reached for her then, drawing her close beneath the candlelit gallery of watchful ancestors, and kissed her with a tenderness that erased every cold, guarded moment of their first weeks together, replacing it with something warm and certain and entirely theirs. When he finally drew back, his forehead resting gently against hers, Eleanor felt, for the first time since that humiliating morning in the churchyard, that she had not merely survived what happened to her. She had found something far better than what she lost. "I was left at the altar by a man too weak to face his own fear," she said quietly, "and I married his brother instead, certain I had simply traded one kind of loneliness for another. I did not imagine, standing there in that churchyard, that I would end this year more cherished than I ever believed myself capable of being." "You were always capable of it," Julian said, his hand cupping her face gently. "You simply needed someone patient enough to prove it to you." Outside the gallery windows, snow continued to fall over the grounds of Ashbourne Manor, settling quietly over the gardens, the ash trees, the long drive where a carriage had once arrived carrying a man the whole county called Ruthless, a man who had stepped down that morning, intending only to correct an injustice, and had instead found, without ever expecting to, a wife he would spend the rest of his life cherishing. They remained in the gallery a while longer, walking slowly past the portraits of ancestors neither of them had ever known, Julian pausing here and there to share some small fragment of family history Eleanor had never heard before. A great-aunt who had scandalized the county by marrying a soldier of no fortune. A distant cousin who had sailed to the colonies and never returned. Small human stories tucked behind the stern painted faces that had once seemed so intimidating to Eleanor on her very first day in this house. "I used to walk this gallery alone, after my parents died," Julian admitted, his voice quieter than usual in the candlelit hush. "I told myself it was simply habit, checking on the house before retiring each night, but I think, if I am honest, I came here because it was the one place in the manor where I did not feel entirely alone. These faces have watched over this family for generations. There was some comfort in that, even in grief." "You will not need to walk it alone any longer," Eleanor said, slipping her hand into his. "No," Julian agreed, something easing visibly in his shoulders, as though a weight he had carried for years had finally, quietly, set itself down. "I do not believe I will." Word of their exchange in the gallery never spread beyond the two of them, though the household staff noted, in the weeks that followed, a warmth between the Duke and Duchess that had not been so openly visible before. Small gestures exchanged across the breakfast table, a hand lingering a moment longer than necessary, laughter drifting occasionally from the library in the evenings where once there had been only careful, measured silence. Mrs. Whitby, who had doubted from the very beginning that Eleanor would last the season, found herself, by the time the first snowdrops pushed up through the frost the following February, quietly rearranging the household's spring schedule around the Duchess's preferences, without needing to be asked twice. Christmas that year was celebrated at Ashbourne Manor, with more warmth than the house had seen in years, Margaret presiding over the festivities with sharp-tongued delight, the tenant families invited for the first time in a generation to share in the manor's hospitality, a tradition Eleanor had gently revived after learning of its lapse. Julian, watching his wife move through the crowded hall, laughing easily with children from the tenant farms, distributing small gifts she had spent weeks preparing herself, found himself thinking, not for the first time, that whatever cruelty his brother's cowardice had inflicted upon her that spring morning in the churchyard, it had ultimately delivered her into a life far richer than the one Charles had ever intended to offer. The following spring, when the ash trees bloomed again in the garden where Julian had first confessed his reasons for marrying her, Eleanor stood beneath their branches with her husband beside her, no longer the uncertain bride who had once sat there clutching a letter she did not know what to do with. She was, instead, entirely and completely the Duchess of Ashbourne, secure in a marriage the whole county had once whispered would never survive its first winter, and had instead become the very thing every one of those whispering guests secretly hoped, in their own quiet lives, they might someday find for themselves. Julian, never a man of easy words, showed his devotion still through action rather than declaration, though the words came more freely now than they once had, offered quietly across the dinner table, murmured in the library beside dying firelight, spoken plainly beneath a gallery of old portraits that had watched, over the generations, a great many marriages come and go within these walls, but perhaps none quite so unlikely, or quite so complete, as the one between a duke who had never expected to love again, and the bride his own brother had been too foolish to keep. 2 years after the snow first settled over the ash trees in the garden where Julian had made his quiet confession, a letter arrived at Ashbourne Manor bearing a foreign postmark, and Eleanor recognized the careless, forward-leaning handwriting immediately, though it had grown steadier since the last time she had seen it. She brought it to Julian in his study, rather than reading it alone, a habit they had settled into over the years, understanding by now that whatever concerned one of them concerned them both. Julian's expression tightened briefly at the sight of his brother's hand upon the envelope, old caution surfacing even after so much time had passed, but he said nothing, as Eleanor broke the seal and read aloud. Charles wrote from a trading post along the coast of a distant colony, his tone entirely changed from the desperate, pleading letters of years before. He wrote of a position he had earned through his own effort, rather than his family's name, of a modest fortune slowly being built through honest work, rather than borrowed against debts he could not repay. He wrote, with what seemed genuine humility, that he had spent a long time reflecting on the man he had been, and that he understood now, more clearly than he ever had standing in that churchyard, exactly what his cowardice had cost him. He did not ask for forgiveness outright, only expressed a hope that time and distance had softened whatever resentment remained, and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had recently married a woman he described simply as steady and kind, qualities he confessed he had once failed to recognize as the truest measure of worth in another person. Eleanor set the letter down, studying her husband's face carefully for whatever reaction it might stir. "He sounds changed," she said finally. "People sometimes do change," Julian admitted, though caution still lingered in his voice. When circumstance finally forces the lesson, they were too comfortable to learn any other way. "Does it trouble you," Eleanor asked, "that he has found some measure of happiness after everything?" Julian considered the question for a long moment, turning it over with the same careful deliberation he brought to every decision that mattered to him. "No," he said eventually, something like genuine relief settling into his answer. "I spent a great many years resenting my brother for leaving his mistakes for others to manage. I find I would rather he learned, even late, to manage his own life honestly, than continue as he was. It costs me nothing to wish him well from this distance, and it costs you even less." Eleanor smiled, folding the letter carefully and setting it aside, no longer feeling any need to burn it the way she once had felt compelled to destroy his earlier words. This letter, unlike the first, carried no claim upon her, no plea for what could not be reclaimed. It was simply the closing of an old wound, tidied at last into something like peace. The following spring, Eleanor found herself once again dressed for a wedding, though this time she stood among the guests rather than the bride herself. watching a young tenant's daughter she had grown fond of during her visits to the farms marry a local blacksmith in the same small church where her own life had once unraveled so publicly. Standing in the churchyard, the same stones beneath her feet, the same hedges lining the same lane, Eleanor felt no lingering grief at the memory, only a distant, almost gentle recognition of how far she had traveled since that terrible spring morning. Julian stood beside her throughout the ceremony, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, and when the vows were spoken and the young couple kissed to the delight of the gathered crowd, he leaned close and murmured, "Does it trouble you, being here again?" "No," Eleanor said, and found, searching herself honestly, that it was entirely true. "I think I needed to stand here again, eventually, to understand how completely it no longer holds any power over me." "And does it?" Julian asked. "Not in the slightest," Eleanor said, smiling up at him. "I remember standing exactly there, at the top of those steps, certain my life had ended in the worst possible way. I did not know in that moment that I was about to be given something far better than what I lost." They walked together through the small celebration that followed, greeting tenants and neighbors who had, over the years, come to regard the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne with a warmth neither of them had expected when Eleanor first arrived at the manor as a stranger in her own wedding gown. Margaret, seated in a place of honor near the church, watched the two of them move through the crowd with visible satisfaction, remarking to a neighboring guest, loudly enough for Eleanor to overhear, that she had known from the very first week that her grandson had married considerably better than his own good sense deserved. It was on the carriage ride home from that wedding, the summer light stretching long and golden across the fields, that Eleanor first noticed the particular, quiet exhaustion that had been settling over her in recent days, a tiredness she had initially dismissed as nothing more than the strain of a long social season. That winter brought changes of its own to Ashbourne Manor, changes far more immediate and far more joyful than any letter from abroad could offer. Eleanor had suspected for some weeks, watching her own body change in small, quiet ways, and when the physician finally confirmed what she had already begun to hope, she found herself uncertain how to tell Julian, worried, in some quiet corner of her heart, that the news might unsettle the careful, steady peace they had built together. She needn't have worried. She told him one evening in the library, their customary place for every important conversation they had shared since the earliest weeks of their marriage, and watched the composed, careful man she had married dissolve entirely into something she had never witnessed before, joy breaking across his features so completely and so openly that Eleanor felt tears rise simply from watching it unfold. "You are certain?" Julian asked, his voice unsteady in a way she had rarely heard from him. "The physician is certain," Eleanor said, laughing softly through her own gathering tears. "Come summer, we shall have need of a nursery." Julian crossed the room and gathered her carefully into his arms, as though she had become suddenly fragile, though Eleanor felt, held against him in the firelight, stronger and more certain of her place in the world than she had ever felt standing alone in that churchyard so many seasons ago. "I did not know," Julian admitted quietly, his voice muffled against her hair, how much more there was left to hope for, until this very moment. The Dowager Duchess received the news with characteristic bluntness, declaring immediately that the child would require a proper nursemaid selected according to her own exacting standards, and spending the following weeks in a flurry of preparation that left half the household staff faintly exhausted by her enthusiasm. Mrs. Whitby, who had once doubted Eleanor would survive her first season as Duchess, took to fussing over her with a devotion that surprised them both, insisting on meals designed specifically to strengthen her through the coming months, and Eleanor found herself, more than once, quietly grateful for a household that had transformed so completely from the cold, watchful place she had first entered as a stranger in her own wedding gown. The child, a daughter, arrived on a bright morning in early summer, her cries filling the manor's halls with a sound Eleanor thought she would remember for the rest of her life. They named her Charlotte, after Julian's mother, whose worn book of poetry still sat upon the library shelf where Eleanor had first discovered it, read now to their daughter in the same evening hours Julian's own mother had once used to read to her sons before either of them was old enough to understand the words. Watching her husband hold their daughter for the first time, his careful composure entirely undone by an emotion he made no effort to hide, Eleanor thought back to the churchyard morning that had once felt like the ending of everything she hoped for, the empty road, the whispering crowd, the humiliation she had been certain would follow her for the rest of her life. She understood now, holding her small family close in the quiet warmth of Ashbourne Manor, that it had never truly been an ending at all. It had been, however painfully disguised at the time, the very beginning of everything she had actually been meant to find. Julian looked up from their daughter's small, sleeping face and found Eleanor watching him, and something passed between them in that quiet moment that needed no words at all. Years of careful trust and steady devotion settled finally into something neither of them would ever again need to guard so carefully. Left at the altar, Eleanor murmured, half to herself, half to him, remembering the woman she had been that spring morning, certain her life had ended before it truly began. And found again, Julian said softly, by someone who never stopped watching for you, long before either of us understood what that watching meant. Outside the nursery window, the ash trees stood full and green in the summer light, the same trees beneath which he had once confessed, haltingly and without any promise of romance, that he could not stand to watch her humiliated twice. They had grown, in the years since, into something far stronger than either of them had dared hope for on that uncertain wedding day, a marriage built first on obligation and honesty, and only later, slowly and completely, on love that asked for nothing and gave everything in return. Margaret visited the nursery the following morning, leaning heavily on her cane but refusing all offers of assistance as she crossed the room to peer down at her new great-grandchild, with an expression far softer than the sharp-eyed woman who had once demanded, on Eleanor's very first day in this house, to know whether she loved the grandson Margaret had spent a lifetime worrying over. "She has your mother's chin," Margaret told Julian, studying the sleeping infant with evident satisfaction, "and her mother's steadiness, if I am any judge of character, which I generally am." She turned to Eleanor then, her expression, for once, entirely without its usual sharpness. "I told you, on your very first visit to my sitting room, that honesty was the only thing worth anything in this family. You have given this house more honesty, and more warmth, than it has known in a great many years. I do not say that lightly." Eleanor felt tears gather again, unexpected and welcome, and reached for the older woman's hand. "Thank you," she said simply, understanding that from Margaret, such plain words carried more weight than any elaborate speech could have offered. And in that quiet nursery, with their daughter sleeping soundly between them, the Duke of Ashbourne, whom the whole county had once called Ruthless, and the bride his own brother had been too foolish to keep, found themselves exactly where they were always meant to be, cherished, steady, and entirely, finally, home.